June 14th, 1987, Harlan County, Kentucky. The rain had stopped 2 days ago, but the ground along Cutter Creek bottom hadn't gotten the message. Dale Whitmore stood at the edge of the embankment with his clipboard pressed against his chest and watched his $500,000 Komatsu PC 400 excavator sink 4 more inches while he watched. It had been hired out from Braddock Equipment Leasing in Lexington, the pride of their fleet, a 1986 model with less than 800 hours on it, and now it was sitting axle deep in what looked like solid ground, but was anything but. The county road project had a hard deadline of July 3rd. The state inspector would be there with his paperwork, and if the culvert work on this stretch of Route 119 wasn't completed, Whitmore Construction would lose the performance bond, forfeit the contract extension, and eat a $78,000 penalty. That was before you counted what it cost to have the machine sitting idle every day it wasn't digging. Dale was the kind of engineer who had built his reputation on never being surprised. He had graduated from the University of Kentucky in 1971 with a civil engineering degree, spent 12 years working for the State Transportation Department, and gone out on his own in 1983. He knew soil tables. He knew load-bearing tolerances. He had looked at the survey maps for this section of road, seen the notation about alluvial clay deposits near the creek bed, and decided his machine was heavy enough and modern enough to handle it. He had been wrong. By 9 that morning, he had 2 other pieces of equipment, a Case 5 80E backhoe and a rented Caterpillar D6D dozer, both chained to the stricken PC 400. Both spinning their tracks uselessly while the big excavator settled deeper. The ground wasn't just soft, it was a buried bog, a hidden pocket of saturated clay and decomposed organic matter that the survey had skimmed over, the kind of thing that was common in creek bottoms in eastern Kentucky and that the old-timers called a sleeper. The more you pushed against it, the deeper it took you. His foreman, a barrel-chested man named Roy Tackett, came up beside him with mud on his boots to his knees. "Dale," he said, "if she goes another 8 inches, we lose the cab." "I know what we lose, Roy." "You want me to call Braddock?" "Braddock can't help us. They'll send another excavator and it'll go in right beside it." Dale looked at the machine. The hydraulic arm was extended at a low angle, braced against the creek bank, and it was the only thing slowing the sinking. Once that arm gave out, or the hydraulic system overheated from the constant pressure, the whole machine would roll. "Call Sampson Recovery out of Hazard." Roy was back in 15 minutes. "Sampson says they can be here Thursday." It was Monday. The crowd of county workers, subcontractors, and curious neighbors that had gathered along the road shoulder was not helping Dale's concentration. There were maybe 30 people standing up on the embankment looking down at the machine. Some of them had coffee. One man had brought a lawn chair. People in Harlan County did not need much reason to stop and watch something go wrong, especially if the something belonged to a construction outfit from Lexington that had come in with shiny equipment and a confidence that hadn't exactly endeared them to the locals. That was when Roy touched Dale's arm and nodded up the road. An old flatbed truck was pulling slowly off Route 119 and onto the grass shoulder. It was a mid-1950s International Harvester, faded red, with wooden stake sides on the bed and a set of wooden runners built into the frame that suggested it had been hauling heavy things for a very long time. Behind the truck, on a low trailer that sat so close to the ground it looked like it was part of the road, sat something that Dale Whitmore at first could not properly identify. It was a crawler tractor. Ancient, narrow-tracked, and high-bodied in the way of machines built before the Second World War, and with a vertical exhaust stack and a hand-crank starting mechanism on the front that had not been standard equipment since 1935 or so. The yellow paint, original Caterpillar yellow, not the bright modern color but the old ochre gold, had faded and worn in patches, and you could see the bare iron underneath in places, but the iron was not rusted through. It was clean iron, gray and faintly oiled. The tracks were the kind with the old-style grousers, the cross cleats that looked like teeth, and the undercarriage was low and wide in a way that the newer machines had abandoned. The whole thing looked like something a museum had reported missing. The man who climbed down from the International's cab did it slowly, the way a man moves when his body has absorbed 60-some years of hard work and knows better than to rush. He was perhaps 70, perhaps a few years past that, with a face that the sun and wind had worked on so thoroughly that it was difficult to read anything on it except patience. He wore clean work pants, a long-sleeved cotton shirt despite the June heat, and suspenders. He stood by his truck for a moment and looked at the komatsu, and something in the quality of his looking was different from the crowd's looking. The crowd was looking at a spectacle. This man was reading something. His name was Elbert Combs. He had farmed the bottom ground along Cutter Creek for 41 years, and his father had farmed it before him for 30 years before that. He had bought the Caterpillar 10, the machine on the trailer, in the spring of 1961 from the estate sale of a man named Dillard Stacy, who had owned the machine since he bought it new in 1931 for $420, which had been an extraordinary sum at the time and which Dillard Stacy had paid in 3 installments over 2 years. Elbert had paid $65 for it at the estate sale and had been maintaining it in the same way ever since, meaning he changed the oil on a strict schedule, kept the tracks properly tensioned, started it once a month whether he needed it or not, and took it to the Harlan County Fair every August, where it ran perfectly, and where the younger farmers treated it as a curiosity and the older ones nodded at it with a recognition that needed no words. For 30 years, his neighbors had been telling him to get rid of it. His son-in-law had offered to haul it to the scrapyard twice. The implement dealer in Cumberland had laughed out loud when Elbert had brought it in for a replacement fuel line fitting in 1979 and said there wasn't a parts house in eastern Kentucky that stocked components for a Cat 10 anymore. Elbert had told him he didn't need a parts house. He had the part in his pocket already. He had made it himself. The joke around the county, if it could be called a joke, was that Elbert Combs kept that old crawler because he was too stubborn to admit it was worthless. The truth, which Elbert had never bothered to explain to anyone who hadn't asked sincerely, was different. He kept it because he understood what it was built to do, and because he had spent 40 years watching the ground along Cutter Creek bottom, and because he knew some things about sleeper bogs that no soil survey conducted from the surface was going to tell you. He had watched the whole operation since Saturday morning, when Whitmore's crew had first moved the PC 400 into position. He had watched them grade the approach. He had watched the operator take the machine down the embankment slope and park it near the creek bed with a confidence that made Elbert set down his fence post digger and look for a long moment before going back to work. He had watched Sunday morning when the machine had started to settle. He had watched Monday morning when the case and the dozer had made it worse. He had said nothing. He walked down the embankment now with his hands at his sides and stopped about 10 feet from where Dale Whitmore and Roy Tackett were standing. He looked at the komatsu once more and then looked at Dale. "I could pull that out," he said. The way he said it was not a boast. It was the same tone a man uses when he tells you the back door is unlocked when you've been trying the front one. Roy Tackett heard it and turned around. Several of the contractors near the bottom of the embankment heard it and turned around. The man in the lawn chair sat up straighter. Dale looked at Elbert Combs. He looked at the ancient crawler on the trailer behind the International truck parked up on the shoulder. He looked back at Elbert. "With that?" he said. "With that," Elbert said. There was a pause, and then Roy made a sound that started as a cough and finished as a laugh. One of the younger equipment operators, a man named Cody, who ran the D6D, laughed openly and without embarrassment. "Sir," Cody said, "that thing up there on that trailer, I don't know what year that was made, but my grandfather probably remembers when it was new." This got a wider laugh from the embankment crowd. Dale raised one hand to quiet it, not because he thought it was unkind, but because he was an engineer, and he wanted to understand what he was dealing with before he dismissed it. "That machine," he said carefully, "whatever it is, it doesn't have the pulling power. My PC-400 weighs 41 tons. The two machines I already have on chains couldn't budge it. What makes you think that—" he gestured toward the trailer, "is going to do something a Cat D6D can't do?" Elbert waited until he was sure Dale was finished. "Your D6D," he said, "weighs about 19 tons. The chains you've got on the Komatsu are set up to pull straight back, and you're asking the machine to fight the suction on the bottom and the weight all at the same time. The suction on a sleeper bog like this one is directional. It's not holding the machine down, even. It's holding it from the front quadrant because that's where the pocket is deepest." He paused. "You pull straight back, you're pulling against the worst part of the suction, and you're peeling the tracks instead of lifting them. You need to break the front seal first. Come up at an angle, short chain, steady tension. Let the ground release the nose before you try to move the weight. A machine that can hold tension without slipping will do it. Your dozer can't hold tension on this ground without spinning." He looked at Dale calmly. "Mine can." One of the engineers from the county road department was standing nearby doing the kind of quiet arithmetic that a man does when someone has just said something that requires checking. He said nothing yet, but he had stopped smiling. Dale crossed his arms. "You're telling me a tractor that was built before the Second World War has better ground contact than a 1985 Caterpillar D6D? "On this ground today, yes," Elbert said. He wasn't asking anything with it. He was just saying it the way you say the sky is overcast. "And if it doesn't work, I'll pull my machine back out and you won't owe me a thing." He looked at Dale once more. "If it works, I'd appreciate a donation to the Harlan County Historical Society. Whatever you think is fair." Dale looked at him for a long moment. 40 tons of machine was sinking behind him. Samson recovery couldn't come until Thursday. The bond deadline was July 3rd. He uncrossed his arms. "All right," he said. "Go ahead." Elbert walked back up the embankment to his truck. He unhooked the trailer latches himself, unhitched the safety chains, and folded down the ramp. Then he climbed up onto the crawler, settled onto the worn steel seat, and primed the fuel line with 3 deliberate strokes of the hand pump. He set the throttle to the mark he had made on the throttle plate with a file in 1963, a mark that corresponded to the idle speed he had established by ear over years of use. He opened the decompression valve, turned the flywheel with the hand crank, not straining against it but working it with a practiced rhythm, the motion of a man who knows exactly how much resistance there is and doesn't fight it. And the engine caught on the third pull with a sound that was wholly unlike any machine noise in the valley that morning. It was a low, irregular chuffing at first, a single-cylinder gasoline engine that the Cat-10 had used before Caterpillar moved to diesel power, and it settled into a rhythm that was slower and more deliberate than any modern construction equipment, and yet somehow absolute. It did not race. It did not roar. It simply ran, steadily and without any mechanical doubt, a sound that several of the older men on the embankment recognized from their childhoods as the sound of real work being done without hurry. The crowd went quiet before the machine ever moved. Elbert backed the crawler off the trailer with the confidence of a man who had done it several hundred times and brought it down the embankment by a route slightly different from the one the D6D had used, picking a line along the gravel edge where the surface drainage had firmed the sub-base. The tracks spread the machine's 7-ton weight across a contact area that, pound per square inch, was dramatically lower than anything in the modern equipment lineup. The old Cat 10 had been built for orchard work and slope cultivation on soft California ground, and the engineers who designed it in the late 1920s had understood pressure distribution with a clarity that modern machine design, focused on horsepower and hydraulics, had largely set aside. The tracks did not spin. The machine moved down the slope at the same steady, idle pace it had started at, leaving 2 clear impression strips in the soft ground that were shallow compared to what any of the modern machines had left. Elbert stopped the crawler about 30 feet from the komatsu and got down. He walked to the komatsu, looked at the angle of the hydraulic arm, looked at the ground at the front of the excavator's tracks, and crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the mud there for a moment in the way of a man reading something. He stood, walked back to his flatbed truck, and unloaded 3 things: a set of heavy logging chains, a steel snatch block that had been forged sometime in the mid-1940s based on its markings, and a short length of 3-inch timber that he used to build up a chocking point under the front edge of the komatsu's right track. He worked alone. Nobody offered to help, and he didn't ask. He ran the primary chain at a 30-degree angle from the nose of the komatsu's undercarriage, not from the tow hook on the back, as the D6D had been chained, but from the front track frame, where releasing the suction seal would begin. He ran the chain through the snatch block anchored around a large sycamore root on the embankment wall, which changed the pulling direction and allowed the force to come upward and forward simultaneously, rather than simply backward. He connected the other end to the drawbar of the Cat 10 with a length of chain that gave him about 8 feet of working distance. Short chain, steady tension. Exactly what he had described. Dale Whitmore watched all of this from 15 feet away without saying a word. The county engineer had his clipboard now and was sketching something on it. Elbert climbed back onto the Cat 10 and advanced the throttle 1 notch above idle. The engine note did not change dramatically. It deepened slightly, the way a man's breathing deepens when he picks something up, and the tracks engaged. The chain came taut. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. The crowd, which had been buzzing with quiet commentary since the old machine arrived, went completely silent. In that silence you could hear the creak, and you could hear the Cat 10's engine working, and you could hear the chain. And it was the chain that told the story. And because it was not clanking or jerking or going slack and snapping tight the way an overpowered machine fights a load. It was singing, a single low harmonic note that meant it was under continuous, even sustained tension. Then the front of the komatsu moved. Not much, perhaps 2 inches, upward and to the right. But 2 inches was 2 inches, and the county engineer stopped writing and raised his head. The ground at the front of the excavator's tracks made a sound. It was a soft bass sound, almost organic, the sound of a seal releasing, and the front of the komatsu's undercarriage lifted fractionally and tilted, and the hydraulic arm that had been braced against the bank shifted its angle 1/2 a degree. "There she goes," said one of the older road workers, very quietly. The Cat 10 didn't speed up. The engine note didn't change. It just kept pulling at the same steady pace, and the komatsu kept coming. 3 inches, 6 inches, a foot. The suction that had held it was directional, as Elbert had said, and breaking it at the front had been the right first move, because now the machine was coming up as it came forward, the track frames lifting out of the clay rather than dragging through it. Roy Tackett was standing at the edge of the embankment with his mouth open. Cody, the D6D operator, had both hands at his sides and was watching with the particular attention of a man who is being taught something and knows it. After 8 minutes and 40 feet of movement, the Komatsu PC-400 was on firm ground. It had not been fast. It had not been dramatic exactly. There had been no roaring engine and no spinning tracks and no great spray of mud. It had been methodical and steady, and it had worked completely. Elbert backed the Cat-10 off the chain, climbed down, unhooked the rigging with the same unhurried efficiency with which he had set it up, and began coiling the logging chains over his arm. He did not look at the Komatsu. He did not look at the crowd. The crowd, for its part, had gone from silence to a sound that started with one person saying something short and genuine, and spread until there were 30 people making the particular noise that human beings make when they have watched something ordinary become extraordinary without quite understanding how. Dale Whitmore walked across to Elbert Combs while the old man was still coiling chain. He didn't approach loudly. He came up and stood a few feet away and waited until Elbert looked up. When he did, Dale said, "I told you it couldn't be done with that machine. I listed the reasons. I was wrong about all of them." Elbert set the chain over his shoulder and looked at Dale directly for the first time since their earlier exchange. "You weren't wrong about the horsepower," he said. "Your D6D has 3 times the horsepower. Horsepower wasn't the problem." What was the problem? Elbert was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing the right number of words. "A machine that can hold steady tension without spinning will always outpull a machine that can't, regardless of rated power. The ground decides what the machine can do, not the spec sheet." He looked toward the Komatsu, sitting on firm ground now, the hydraulic arm at rest. "You were fighting the bog." "I was asking it to let go." Dale was quiet for a long moment. The county engineer had come down the embankment and was standing nearby, not intruding, but close enough to hear. "How did you know about the front quadrant?" Dale asked. "The soil survey didn't show a differential pocket." "Soil survey was done from the road surface in a dry September," Elbert said. "I've farmed this creek bottom for 40 years. I know where the sleepers are because I've watched where the water stands after a rain and where the frost heaves different in March. That's not something you get from a survey. That's something you get from being here." Dale put out his hand. Elbert took it. It was a firm handshake, neither demonstrative nor perfunctory, the handshake of 2 men who have reached a straight accounting. "What do you think is fair?" Dale asked. "For the Historical Society." "Whatever you think," Elbert said, and went back to loading his chains. Dale wrote a check for $500 to the Harlan County Historical Society that afternoon. He wrote it from the company account, not his personal one, and he noted in the company records that it had been earned. That night he sat at the kitchen table of the motel in Cumberland where the crew was staying and went over the soil assessment methodology they had used on the Route 119 project. He marked 3 other locations along the creek bottom where the survey data was thin. The next morning he brought in a hand auger and tested those locations himself before moving any equipment. He found 2 more soft pockets. Roy Tackett, who had been with Dale for 6 years, said the next day that he had never seen Dale Whitmore use a hand auger on a job site before. "You learn things," Dale said, and said nothing more about it. The Komatsu was back to work by Tuesday afternoon. The culvert work on Route 119 was completed on June 29th, 4 days ahead of the state deadline. The performance bond was collected. The penalty was avoided. In the paperwork Dale filed with Braddock Equipment Leasing explaining the delay and the recovery method, he wrote a 3-paragraph description of the Cat-10 and its operator that was more detailed and more technically respectful than anything else in the report. The leasing manager in Lexington who read it told his assistant it was the strangest recovery narrative he had ever seen. Word of what had happened at Cutter Creek traveled through Harlan County by the mechanism that has always transmitted such things in small communities, which is to say that Roy Tackett told his wife, who told the women in her Thursday morning quilting group, and the story grew slightly in each telling, but not dishonestly. The essential facts remained intact because the essential facts were good enough on their own. By the following weekend, the story that was being told at the Cumberland Farmers Co-op and at the feed store on Main Street and at the barber shop on Mound Street was accurate in all the ways that mattered. An old farmer with a 1931 Caterpillar had pulled out a $500,000 machine that 2 modern pieces of construction equipment had failed to move, had done it in under 10 minutes, had charged nothing for himself, and had gone home. The man in the lawn chair, whose name was Carroll Hensley and who was retired from the county road department, told the story at least a dozen times in the following weeks. He told it correctly, and with a visible satisfaction that his wife noted was out of proportion to his usual demeanor. "It's just a good story," he told her, which was true, but it was also that Carroll Hensley was 63 years old and had spent a career watching the road department buy newer and larger equipment with the steady conviction that size was wisdom, and something in what he had seen that Monday morning had felt like a confirmation of something he had known for a long time without quite having the words for it. Dale Whitmore came back to Harlan County the following spring on a bridge replacement project on the other side of the county. Before he started work, he drove out to Elbert Combs's farm on the Cutter Creek Road. He didn't have a specific question. He brought a pound of coffee as a reason to stop, the way a man will bring a small thing as an acknowledgement that he is not just coming to extract information. Elbert was in the machine shed working on the Cat-10, which he had out of service in May every year for what he called a going over, which involved checking every fitting, cleaning the fuel system, repacking the track bearings, and verifying the governor settings. He accepted the coffee without ceremony and offered Dale a stool. They talked for an hour. Elbert talked about the creek bottom and the way the water moved through the ground in different seasons. He talked about which fields held moisture and which drained fast and why, and how his father had taught him to read the vegetation as an indicator of subsurface conditions, and how a line of willows in an otherwise dry hillside almost always meant a buried water channel. Dale asked questions that were genuine, and Elbert answered them without performance or qualification. It was a conversation between 2 men who respected different kinds of knowledge and who had arrived at that respect the hard way. Dale used a hand auger at every project site he worked on in eastern Kentucky from that year forward. His foreman, Roy Tackett, who bought out Dale's business when Dale retired in 1998, kept the practice. Roy taught it to the 2 younger engineers who came up under him, and when they asked where it came from, he told them about the Monday in June 1987 at Cutter Creek, when an old farmer in suspenders had explained the difference between rated power and effective force to a credentialed engineer in front of 30 witnesses using a machine that had been built during the Hoover administration. Elbert Combs kept the Cat-10 where he had always kept it, in the back bay of the machine shed with a canvas tarp over the engine and a set of wooden blocks under the tracks to keep the grousers off the concrete floor. He started it on the first Sunday of every month, let it run for 20 minutes, checked the oil, and put it back. In August of every year, it went to the Harlan County Fair and ran perfectly, as it had done every year since 1964, when Elbert had first taken it there. The old men still nodded at it. The younger farmers still treated it as a curiosity, though after 1987 the curiosity had a different quality to it. A story attached to a thing changes the way people look at it, and the story attached to the Cat 10 was specific and verifiable and had witnesses. Elbert's son, Raymond, had been 32 in 1987 and had watched the whole business from the embankment with his arms folded and said nothing. He had spent 10 years gently suggesting that his father sell the old crawler and put the money into something useful, and he had never mentioned it again after that June morning. In 1994, when Elbert's hands began to trouble him with arthritis, and he couldn't manage the hand crank starting reliably, Raymond learned to do it. He learned the throttle mark and the prime count and the decompression sequence, the same way Elbert had learned it from the estate sale paperwork Dillard Stacy had left in the toolbox in 1961. There was a satisfaction in learning a thing completely that Raymond found he had not expected. Elbert Combs passed in February of 2001 at 83 in the house where he had lived his entire adult life. He left the farm to Raymond and left the Cat 10 to Raymond specifically and separately in a handwritten codicil that the lawyer found slightly unusual but entirely valid. Raymond did not need to be told what to do with it. He already knew. In the late summer of 2003, a gas pipeline crew working in the Cutter Creek Valley put a piece of equipment into a soft spot 2 fields over from the original site. It was a Caterpillar 325C excavator, a machine that in 2003 represented modern practice in pipeline construction. The ground crew called for a wrecker and a specialized recovery outfit from Lexington. The Lexington outfit said they couldn't come for 2 days. Raymond Combs was haying the second cut in the adjacent field when he saw the crew clustered around the sunken machine. He had the Cat 10 on his trailer because he'd been moving it between storage barns. He stopped the truck on the road shoulder and looked at the situation for a while. He recognized what he was looking at. He drove down. The pipeline crew's site supervisor was a man in his mid-30s named Kevin, whose father had worked for Whitmore Construction in the 1980s, and whose father had told him more than once the story of Cutter Creek and the 1931 Caterpillar and the engineer from Lexington who had learned something about the difference between a spec sheet and the ground. Kevin looked at the Cat 10 on the trailer and then looked at Raymond and said slowly, "Is that the machine?" "It's the machine," Raymond said. Kevin was quiet for a moment. "My dad said the old guy wouldn't take any money." "He wouldn't," Raymond said. "Will you?" Raymond thought about it for a second. "Historical Society," he said. Kevin laughed, not at Raymond, but at the rightness of it, and then Raymond unhitched the trailer and began unloading the Cat 10, and it was the same machine doing the same work on the same ground, pulling steady and true on a short chain at a careful angle while the modern equipment watched from the firm bank. And the engine note was exactly what it had always been: low, deliberate, and certain, the sound of something built to last, doing the thing it was built to do. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built,